A what? Trallion, general of the Alliance forces, paladin of the Silver Hand, stared in utter bafflement at the tiny figure who sat before him. A rat problem, the gnome explained. When you said there was an issue with wildlife that was threatening to derail the entire tram construction project, Trallion said slowly, I assumed you would run into difficulties with the subterranean lake, or perhaps the creatures in... Trallion's voice trailed off. You did say rat. Indeed, Tinker Gelbin, Mechatorke, head of the project to construct a mechanical transportation system that would eventually link Stormwind and Ironforge, shuddered. Horrible things, those vermin. Some bodies we've found were this big. Mechatorke spread his hands about 6 inches apart. Granted, on that tiny frame, that was a substantial amount. But still, the engineer... That's what she said. The engineer had called an emergency session with the general of the Alliance over a rat problem. Trallion still wasn't quite sure what to think of the small beings, who were good friends with the dwarves. If Mechatorke, who had come to Stormwind a few years ago with the full endorsement of the Dwarven King, Magnai Bronzebeard himself, was any indication, they were a curious bunch. Mechatorke talked fast and used terms that Trallion was utterly unfamiliar with, and struck him as a jovial fellow. The gnome representative didn't even reach Trallion's hip when standing, and was all but swallowed by the large chair in which he was now ensconced. The table was level with his bright eyes, and at one point, Mechatorke let out an exasperated huff and simply climbed atop it to point at the blueprints he had unfolded within 2 minutes of his arrival. They've completely infested the prototype, chewing through the wiring here, here, and here, Mechatorke continued, stabbing a tiny finger down at the blueprints. We can't extract it or even get in to repair it without losing more good people to those vile creatures. The last team we sent in after it, well, it wasn't a pretty sight. His large eyes looked solemn. Trallion nodded. The idea of a tram had struck him as brilliant when it was first proposed shortly after the Second War. Progress on rebuilding Stormwind was being made, but slowly. It was a long and dangerous trek from Ironforge to Stormwind, and King Bronzebeard had chafed at the delay in getting supplies to his allies. Trallion felt out of his depth at the time, and still had that reaction every time Mechatorke had come to him with updates or problems. He was a paladin, a warrior by fate and a priest by training. He knew little enough of simple construction, and this tram was quite beyond him, especially when Mechatorke talked so fast. Trallion had discovered that gnomes were fiercely, eccentrically intelligent, and he was willing to believe it if this contraption that Mechatorke proposed did even part of what he claimed it would do. He remembered their first conversation. How safe will it be? He had asked. Well, we are on the cutting edge of technology with it, you must understand, Mechatorke had said, running a hand along his mutton chop whiskers. But I'm willing to bet it will eventually be as safe as the safest gnomish creation ever. Something in the sound of his voice had warned Trallion that might not be particularly safe at all. But he wasn't a builder or an engineer. Still, it was coming along. Until this rat problem. I understand that rats are proportionately much larger, and therefore much more threatening to your people than to mine, Trallion said as diplomatically as he could, although he wondered why Bronzebeard hadn't handled the problem on Ironforge end. And we can't have them chewing through the wiring. I'll send some of my men back to Ironforge with you. They'll, hunt down the vermin and help you effect repairs. Trallion might have been Great Father Winter himself, the way Mechator reacted. Thank you, this is excellent. It will be back on track in a jiffy, and then we can finally tackle that pesky underwater problem. The gnome slipped off the chair and reached up a small hand to Turalyon, then pumped it vigorously. "Go speak to aLilFoxz," Turalyon said, referring to a former guard at the keep, who now served as Turalyon's assistant in all things non-military. "He'll take care of the arrangements." Turalyon watched the gnome depart and turned back to his correspondence. Dozens of letters from so many people, all wanting something from him. He ran a hand through his short, blonde hair and sighed. A walk would do him good. The air was clean and clear as he stepped outside, although clouds lowered. He walked up to the canal, gazing briefly at his reflection in the now cleared water. Turalyon had never been to Stormwind until the day he and his men had entered the city 2 years ago, and so he had not had the additional horror of knowing what the city had been like before it fell. It was horrific enough as it was. These famous canals had been clogged, with stones and lumber, with dirt, with defiled corpses. The dead had been respectfully buried, the rubble cleared. Now the canals ran freely again, connecting the various parts of the city. Turalyon lifted his gaze to the white stone, gray now in the dimming light and the red roofs. The Dwarven district housed many of Bronzebeard's hard-working men, sent along with Mekatorke, and nestled next to that area was the cathedral. Thunder rumbled as he approached. He fixed his eyes on the glorious building, one of the first to be completed in its entirety. The orcs had damaged it badly, but even then it was a place of safety. The enemy had not realized that this cathedral had vast rooms and catacombs beneath it. Dozens had huddled there, sheltered by its stone while terror raged above them. It was one of the few buildings large enough to house the refugees in the initial stages of reconstruction. And even now, people flocked to it when they were ill or injured, or even just in need of a little reminder of the light, like Turalyon. Oof, he stumbled forward, so lost in thought that he hadn't seen the pair of children until they'd slammed into him. "Sorry, mister," the boy cried. The girl gazed up at him with solemn brown eyes. Turalyon smiled and patted her hair as he spoke to the boy. "With an attack like that, you'll make a fine soldier one day," he said. "Oh yes, sir. I hope so, sir. You think all the orcs will be dead before I'm old enough to kill them?" Turalyon's smile faltered. "I'm sure you'll be able to serve the Alliance well," he said, evading the question. Revenge, the fiery need and anger it kindled in the heart, had cost Turalyon someone he loved. He would say nothing to foster racial hatred in a child. Keeping his hand on the girl's head, he murmured a soft prayer. Light glowed around his hand, and for a brief moment, the child was enveloped in radiance. Turalyon lifted his other hand and blessed the boy as well. Awe shone in both pairs of eyes that regarded him. "Light bless you both. Now, you two had best be getting home. Looks like rain." The boy nodded and grabbed his sister's hand. "Thanks, Mr. Paladin." The two ran toward their home. It was not far. Turalyon realized they lived in the building adjacent to the cathedral, the orphanage. So many orphans, so many lives lost. Thunder rumbled again, and the havens let loose. Rain began pouring down in sheets. Turalyon sighed, pulling his cape around himself, and running lightly up the steps to the cathedral, getting soaked even in that short distance. The smell of incense and the soft, barely audible sound of chanting coming from somewhere in the building soothed him at once. He had become used to giving orders, to fighting battles, to emerging from them covered in his own blood or that of the orcs. It was good to come back to the church and to remember his origins as a simple priest. A soft smile curved his lips as he beheld the brethren, his fellow knights of the Silver Hand, doing their duties here as surely as they had been on the battlefield. Archbishop Alonzus Fowl had created the order 3 years ago, and it was by his decree that paladins now served humbly in the communities that had been so devastated by the war. Even as he looked around, Turalyon saw his old friend Uther, whom he himself had given the title Lightbringer. Trollian was used to seeing this powerfully built man in full armor, swinging his weapon, his ocean-colored eyes afire with zeal as the light came to him in the form of powerful attacks. But Uther now was clad in simple robes. He was attending to a woman who looked exhausted and drained, gently wiping her forehead with a damp cloth and cradling something in his free hand. As Trollian drew closer, he saw that the bundle Uther held so gently was a newborn, its skin still mottled from birth. The new mother smiled tiredly, but happily, and reached for her child. Its lusty, healthy wail was the sharp, sweet song of hope. Uther rested his hand on the woman and blessed her and the child, as Trollian had done with the orphans earlier. Trollian realized that although Uther was obviously at home on the battlefield, using the light to take the lives of those who would slay him and those he served, he was equally at home here in the cathedral, bringing a new little life into the world. Such was the dichotomy of paladins. There were warriors and healers both. Uther glanced up and smiled, rising to greet his friend. "Trollian," he said, his deep, gruff voice. The two paladins clasped hands. "Good to see you. About time you found your way down here," Uther cuffed the younger man playfully. "You're right," Trollian agreed, chuckling. "It's good to be here. It's too easy to get caught up in all the things that need to be done but can never quite be finished. Like a rat problem." "Eh? I'll tell you later. For now, how can I help?" This was what mattered, he thought, not staying holed up in the keep pushing paper. Uther's eyes narrowed slightly as he looked over Trollian's shoulder. "I think you've got some of that unfinished business right here," he said. "Oh," Trollian said casually, turning around. It was like seeing a ghost, a moment wrenched out of its proper place in space and time and incongruously reenacted. She stood before him, face and hair and clothing wet, emerald eyes fixed with his. She had gotten caught in the rain, looking almost as she had the night nearly 2 years ago, coming to him now as she had come to. Ilaria Windrunner's eyes narrowed, as if she too recalled that night, and found it an unpleasant memory. Trollian felt a chill sweep over him that had nothing to do with his wet clothing. She bowed stiffly, first to Uther, then to him. "Lightbringer, General." This was how it was to be played then. "Ranger." He was surprised at how calm his voice sounded. He had half expected it to crack with emotion. "What brings you here?" "Tidings," she said, "of the worst sort." Her eyes flickered to Trollian's and back to Uther's. Little else would. Trollian felt a muscle twitch in his cheek and gritted his teeth. "Then pray deliver them." The elf looked around, slightly contemptuously. "I wonder if I have not come to the wrong place for aid. I did not expect to find generals, knights, and holy warriors tending to babies in a church." Trollian welcomed the anger. It chased away the heart sickness. "We serve where we are called, Ilaria, all of us. I feel certain you didn't come all the way here just to insult us. Speak." Ilaria sighed. "A short time ago, I met with Khadgar and several of the Alliance leaders, including your own king. It seems that there is a dimensional rift where the dark portal once stood. Khadgar believes that very soon, orcs, perhaps an entire second horde, could come through again. He sent me on Griffinback at once to inform you." She had their attention now, and they listened in silence as she repeated what she had learned. Not for the first time since the Lion of Azeroth's death, Trollian wished Anduin Lothar were here. He often found himself wishing that when faced with a difficult decision, or impending combat, or simply the need to talk to someone, Lothar would have responded instantly, calmly but decisively, and others could not have helped but follow. While the veterans of the war had begun calling themselves the Sons of Lothar, Trollian himself, Lothar's lieutenant, was not comfortable with the term. He did not feel like a son of the great man, although he would defend Lothar's ideals to his last breath. He was still thinking when Ilaria finished talking and turned her eyes expectantly upon him. "Well?" she demanded. "What say the Wildhammers on all this? What does Kurdrin think?" "I doubt he knows," Ilaria admitted, the blonde ranger having the grace to at least be embarrassed by the statement. "What? You flew all this way to inform me, on one of their griffins no less, and no one told the Wildhammers' leader what was going on?" She shrugged again, and Trollian bit back a curse. During the Second War, the Alliance had fought together, elves and humans and dwarves, both the Wildhammers and their Brawnbeard cousins side by side. But in the past year, it seemed the human rulers had been distancing themselves from their non-human allies. The elves still participated in the defense of Nethergard, but that was as much from their fascination with all magic as from any desire to help humans. The Bronzebeard dwarves had an ambassador, Muradin Bronzebeard, at Lordaeron, and so they maintained close ties with King Taranis. And there was cheerful little Mecha Torque and his assistants here in Stormwind. Trollian felt the heat of shame rush through him at the recollection of his amusement at the gnome's expense earlier, when Mecha Torque and his people were performing an invaluable service to strangers. But for all the Wildhammers' loyalty and bravery and skill, many humans seemed to think the Griffin Riders were little more than savages. "Will you wait for the dwarves to give you instructions, or perhaps Lothar's ghost?" Trollian frowned. Color rose in Ilaria's cheeks, and she glanced down, realizing she had gone too far. "The Wildhammers have been staunch allies," Trollian said, in a soft yet sure voice. "They are as much a part of the Alliance as anyone. I will see to it that they are informed as soon as possible." "We must go immediately," Ilaria said. "The Griffin will bear you to Lordaeron. I will make my own way there." She wouldn't even deign to ride with him then. Trollian didn't answer at once. He glanced at Uther, who was bridling on his behalf. Their eyes met for a moment. The bigger man nodded and turned back to the young mother and her child. "You will bring the members of your orders, yes?" Ilaria said, almost perfunctorily, as if she knew the answer already. When Trollian shook his head, her jaw dropped. "What? Why not?" "The Archbishop wishes them to stay here in Lordaeron, to tend to the people who need them." "You haven't even asked." "I know without asking. Don't worry, if the need is great enough, they will come. But need can take many forms. Come, let us talk for a bit." "We should. 5 minutes will change nothing." She frowned. He realized she was shivering. A drop of rain slid from behind her wet hair down her face, looking like a tear. But it was nothing nearly so soft. At that instant, he wanted to pull her into his arms so badly. This coldness, this acerbic venom that poisoned her words and turned her lovely face ugly with hatred. He knew what it was, and knew why she carried it. And knowing was like a knife in his heart. "I wrote. You never answered," he said quietly. She shrugged, pulling her cloak about her slim frame automatically, although what she needed was dry clothing. "I have been traveling, on patrol. Our most recent task was a patrol through the Alterac Mountains," she said. "There were rumors of orcs hiding among the peaks there." She allowed herself a grim smile. "We found 10 of them." Trollian didn't have to ask what she and her rangers had done with the discovered orcs. He wondered if she'd started taking trophies. He'd seen her once crouching over a body, a savage grin on her face, and had been stunned by the glee she took in the killing. "Ilaria," he said quietly, "I've been writing you, and you've never answered. You owe me nothing, I understand that. But if what happened between us means you can no longer work with me, I need to know now. I am your commander. The Alliance, can't afford to find out on the battlefield that you're not listening or not obeying." He waited until she looked at him. "Do you have a problem with that?" "There is no problem," the blonde elf answered sharply. "The Alliance wants every orc dead. So do I. We can work together on that. That's all we are to you now, a means to an end, a way to kill more orcs more quickly." "What else is there?" she answered. "Khadgar only found me because my band and I were hunting orc renegades in Alterac. I agreed to meet with him at Nethergard because his messenger said it involved orcs. And I agreed to bring his summons to you for the same reason." She frowned. "And the sooner we reach Lordaeron, the sooner I can seek out more green-skin abominations and cleanse this land of their filth." Her voice rose with passion and her eyes flashed. Some heads turned in their direction. "I will see them dead, every last one of them, even if it takes me 100 years. Trallian felt a shiver run down his spine. "Ilaria," he began, pitching his voice low, "you're talking genocide." The smile that curved her lips was a cruel one. "It is only genocide when those being slain are people. This is nothing more than exterminating vermin." He realized with a shock that she honestly believed her words. She really didn't see the orcs as sentient people. She saw them as abominations, as monsters, as rats. Trallian knew he had slain his fair share of them. He had done so at times with great anger in his heart at what they had done to his people. But this, Ilaria didn't want justice. She wanted the orcs to pay for the crimes they had committed. She wanted to hurt them, to exterminate an entire race if she could. He took a step toward her, reaching out a hand, hoping to connect. "You've lost so much, I know that." Ilaria knocked his hand away. "Ha! A human speaks of loss? What do you know of it? Your lives are so brief, you never learn what it means to truly love someone." Trallian felt the blood drain from his face. For a moment, he couldn't respond. She stared at him, breathing quickly, daring him to speak. "Just because you live longer doesn't mean you feel more," he said. "Trust me on that one." He gave her a lopsided smile. Her face only hardened the more. "So you are better than me because you live for this long?" she challenged, snapping her fingers. "Or are you better than me because of your precious light?" "Ilaria, I want to see justice done, you know that. But you're not talking justice, you're talking vengeance. And I see what it's doing to you. The light isn't mine, it's everyone's. It's about healing. It's..." "Don't you dare lecture me," she warned, her voice dropping to a steely hiss. "Your holy light didn't stop the orcs from tearing open a way into our world, did it? The light can't restore my ravaged homeland, or give me back my..." She closed her jaw with a snap. Trallian stared at her for a long moment, then sighed deeply. "Ranger," he said formally, "here are my orders. For the moment, you will stay here in Stormwind, along with half of my troops and myself. Send for your rangers, have them gather here. The city has just started to get its feet underneath it. I won't leave it unprotected." Her jaw tightened. "So we're just going to wait out the war here, sir, like cowards, sir." Trallian did not rise to the bait. "I will request reinforcements, and when they come we'll leave, but until then we stay here." She nodded. "You'll protect a city when it's your own. I see now. Permission to leave to gather my rangers, sir." Ilaria's words were designed to get under his skin, and they had, but Trallian was more concerned about what had happened to Ilaria, or more correctly, what she was doing to herself to cause her to speak them. She had changed so very much. Sadly, he recalled their first initial reactions to one another. He stammering, awestruck first by her grace and beauty, and then later by her consummate skill, and she, amused, intrigued, slightly supercilious. He had lost some of his awe, not all of it, he would never lose all of it, but some. She had grown to respect him, to like him, to seek out his company, to want him by her side in battle, and he'd once believed in a more intimate way. But there seemed little of that woman left, and all he could do was be saddened and worried by her changes, and wonder if she'd let hate for the orcs get in the way of her judgment. By the light, if she died because of this recklessness of hers. He realized he was staring and nodded. He did not trust himself to speak past the lump in his throat. Alaria inclined her head, the bearish gesture of required respect, and strode past him. Trellian watched her go, wondering if he'd made the right decision. What would Lothar have done? Would he have waited until reinforcements came, or would he have charged into battle? Was he wasting time or being smart? Was it enough to send his second-in-command, Daneth Trollbane, and half his men to Nethergard right now? He shook his head, clearing it. He couldn't afford to second-guess right now, and his decision felt like the right one. He'd need to send some messengers, one to the Wildhammers, letting them know that, and one to Lordaeron, and one, he thought with a small, sad little smile, to Mekatorke, to let him know that unfortunately, the men intended as rat catchers for the tram would not be coming after all. Alaria did not head back to the keep as she had said she would. Instead, when she left the cathedral, she started to run, her feet swift and almost completely silent as they carried her along the streets toward the great gates of the city. She ignored startled glances as she ran, permitting the gawking stares to fuel her anger, and raced through the gates into the wooded area beyond. She ran until she found a small stream, and there, beneath the boughs of the sheltering trees, she sank down on the sodden earth. She was cold and soaked to the skin, but she ignored the discomfort. It had gone worse than she feared. How was it that a mere human could rattle her so? He was a child beside her, a rude, loud child, who, even as she thought the words, she knew that they were wrong. Trellian was shockingly young compared with her, but he was reckoned a man among his own people, and he was kind and wise and smart. And at one point, so long ago it seemed now, she had thought she loved him. Alaria growled and put a clenched hand to her heart, as if warning it not to soften. Her fingers touched the wrought silver of a necklace that held 3 precious stones. It had been given to her by her parents. It was a link with a world that had once been, a world of grace and beauty and balance, a world the orcs had forever crippled. The trees here were not those of the forest of Eversong. Those beautiful golden leaf patriarchs whose branches had held her and her sisters, and she squeezed her eyes shut and whispered the name, Lirith, her youngest brother. She remembered him now the way he had looked the last time she had seen him. Beautiful, laughing, dancing beneath the golden leaves as a piper played a sprightly tune. Young, so young. He wanted to be a ranger like his sisters. But in this moment, she had frozen forever in her mind. Alaria watched him simply enjoy being alive. The orcs had slaughtered him, snuffing out his bright life like a flame pinched between a cruel thumb and forefinger. Had slaughtered so many, too many other kin, cousins, aunts, uncles, nieces, had slaughtered friends she had known longer than Trellian had been alive. And they would pay. Her hand tightened on the necklace. They would suffer as gentle young Lirith had, as her people, as her city, as her land had. They would taste 1,000-fold the pain they inflicted upon her. It would be sweet, sweet as the blood she had once tentatively licked from her hand after a kill. Trellian had almost caught her that time. Now, she told herself, he must not know. He must not stop her. He must not soften her heart, as he had come perilously close to doing once before. Whatever the cost, Alaria Windrunner would have her revenge. Rain pounded down outside, but the stables were dry, if steamy. The scent of horses and leather filled the moist air. The beasts whickered pawing at the hay-covered cobblestones beneath their hooves as riders saddled them. They were trained war horses and had not seen battle in some time. They seemed as anxious as Daneth Trollbane was to depart. Daneth's men, though, were greener. His own horse had been saddled and ready quickly, and now he moved among his soldiers. Make haste. He glowered at one who was having trouble with the stirrups. This is no pleasure outing. Trellian had let him choose half among the military left in Stormwind. He'd chosen cavalry units he knew would be able to cross the miles quickly and form ranks again soon after. He needed to move fast, but they had to be careful not to wear out the horses. He suspected that they wouldn't have the luxury of a rest to reorganize and regroup, but most of the men he'd fought with were scattered now over the human territories, and there was no time to summon all the veterans home. "We don't want to miss the fight, do we, sir?" a soldier said, with a grin as he grasped his mount's reins. He was little more than a boy, really, too young to have fought in the Second War, one of the many who had joined after the war's end, hoping to fill out the ranks so badly decimated by the fighting. Daneth shook his bald head and ran a hand through his silvering beard, trying to recall the boy's name. Feral, that was it. "You've not faced orcs before, have you, Feral?" he rumbled. "No, sir," Feral replied, with a wide grin that showed how young he really was. "But I'm looking forward to it, sir." "I'm not," Daneth replied, making the soldier gasp and stare. "You're not?" the boy asked, his voice faltering a little as he noted the commander's grim expression. "But why not, sir? We're going to trample them, aren't we? I heard that there weren't many orcs left anymore, and they're hiding in the woods and in the mountains like wild animals." "The ones who got left behind when the portal closed, that's true," Daneth agreed. "But that's not what we're dealing with here. They think the dark portal is going to reopen. Do you know what that means?" The soldier gulped, and Daneth raised his voice to make sure the soldiers saddling their mounts around them could hear him as well. "It means we won't be facing a ragtag group of orc survivors, boy. We'll be facing the Horde, the largest fighting force ever seen. And that force has never been defeated, not in truth." "But we won the war, sir," one of the other men, Van, Daneth recalled, protested. "We conquered them." "That we did," he agreed, "but only because some of their own forces turned on them, and we were able to crush them at sea. What we fought at Blackrock was only a portion of the true Horde, and even then it was a close thing." He shook his head. "For all we know, there could be as many as a dozen more clans back on the Orcs' world, just waiting to break through again." He heard the muttering and gasping that swept through the men. "That's right, lads," he announced loudly. "We could well be heading toward our deaths here." "Sir, why are you telling us this?" Feral asked quietly. "Because I don't believe in lying about our chances," his commander answered. "You've a right to know what you'll be facing, and I don't want you going in thinking this will be easy, expecting hard fighting and staying sharp. Go in expecting trouble, and you're more likely to survive." He grinned suddenly. "And then you can call yourselves Sons of Lothar." All around him men nodded, more sober now. These were good men, if not as seasoned as he might wish. He already regretted the deaths he knew would come if the portal did indeed reopen, but they were sworn to defend the Alliance, even at the cost of their own lives. He just hoped they wouldn't be dying for nothing. Even though precious time was ticking past, Daneth permitted himself a few moments to look at them. He memorized faces, summoned names to mind. He had no children of his own. While they were under his command, he was father to these boys, even if they were all sons of Lothar. That made him smile slightly. "Mount up, lads." 2 minutes later, they were galloping down the cobblestone streets of Stormwind and out the main gates. "Listen, do you hear that?" Randall laughed. "You're getting jumpy, William," he told his friend. "It's just the wind." He glanced around, looking across the blasted landscape, and shivered. Nothing to block it out here. William nodded, but still seemed easy. Maybe you're right, he admitted, rubbing his face with one gloved hand. I hate this detail. Why we've got to guard this thing anyway? Isn't that what the Magi are for? Both soldiers glanced behind them. If they squinted, they could make out a shimmer in the air, just beyond a pile of old rubble. The distortion was narrow, perhaps the width of a man, but twice as tall. They had been told that the rift was all that remained of the dark portal, and that their task was to keep watch over it. Dunno, Randall replied. You'd think if anything did happen, the Magi'd know before we did. He shrugged. At least it's an easy job, and our shift's over in another hour. William started to say something else and stopped, his eyes wide. There, he whispered. Hear that? Hear what? William shushed him frantically. They sat stone still for a moment, ears straining, and then Randall heard it. It was like a low moan, then a high whistle, as if the winds were sweeping across a wide plain before cutting through the valley around him. His eyes went back to the rift, and gasped, almost dropping his shield and spear. It was wider now. Sound the alarm, he told William frantically, but his friend was frozen in fear, eyes riveted on the sight before them. William, sound the alarm. As William hurried to obey, the rift shimmered again, growing brighter, colors leaking out along its expanding edges. It seemed to split open, like a mouth ravenous for food, and shadows billowed forth. They spread rapidly, and Randall blinked, unable to see the rift or the bubble below it anymore. Even William had vanished, though he could hear his friend blowing on the horn, alerting the other guards. Randall swiveled this way and that, trying to peer through the sudden darkness, his spear and shield at the ready. Was there something there, or there? He strained to listen. Was that a sound? A thud as if something had rolled over or dropped? Was that another? Yes, he was sure he'd heard something now. He turned in the direction he thought it had come from, raising his spear slightly and hoping it wasn't William. Those definitely sounded like footsteps, heavy ones, and many of them. Hold, Randall shouted, wishing his voice weren't shaking. Who goes there? Stand and identify yourself in the name of the Alliance. The steps grew closer and he spun, trying to pinpoint their source. Were they behind him? Off to his side, right in front of him. He turned slightly as the ground shook beneath his feet, raising his shield instinctively, and cried out as something heavy crushed it like paper, the impact shattering his arm as well. Blinking away the pain, Randall thrust his spear forward, but something caught the weapon's long haft and wrenched it from his grip. A face appeared out of the darkness, inches from his own. A wide, heavy face, with a looming brow, squat nose, two sharp tusks jutting up from the lower lip. The horrifying face leered at Randall, and he had a brief glimpse of something else rushing toward him, from the shadows, something wide and flat and curved. The other guards rallied, alerted by William's horn, but it was too little too late. The darkness-filled valley preventing them from even seeing their foes, and while the humans blundered about in confusion, the orc warriors and death knights poured out of the newly expanded rift, crushing everyone in their path. It was more of a slaughter than a true battle. Within minutes, every human defender was dead or dying, and the orcs controlled the Azeroth side of the dark portal.